we are heading to a new place. I am convinced of it. It is going to be painful, messy, and full of uncertainty, but it is also inevitable, and it will end up placing all the big issues that we're struggling with in a different type of context.
Welcome to The Feedback Loop, a Sino Global Capital podcast where we keep you in the loop about the most pressing issues in Web3 today. I'm your host, Mona Hamdy, a Harvard teaching fellow with 20 years of experience in nonprofit and sustainable development. I started using emerging technologies 15 years ago, working with remote peoples to create new economies based on the reversal of climate change. And today, I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Sino, where I hope to bring beneficial technologies to the most forgotten corners of this planet. In today's episode, I'm joined by Noelle Acheson. She's TradFi background, former MD of research for CoinDesk. She needs no introduction. She is the author of my favorite Substack. I get it on the daily and the weekly, and you should too. Crypto is macro now. Noelle made a pivot recently into really focusing on what those interconnected and global forces around the world mean for our industry and vice versa. She spent the bulk of her career writing and speaking about the political impact and economic impacts of blockchain technology, of cryptocurrency digital assets. I'm joined by her today to talk about the institutional side of crypto, maybe to touch on things like the environment, algorithmic stablecoins, and what they mean for the future of the regulated space of our industry. Really just the things that people around the world should care about when talking about our industry. Hey, Noelle.
Mona, thank you so much for that amazing introduction. It is such a pleasure to be here with you. And I just want to say thank you for everything that you do for this industry and making it accessible and understandable to people all around the world, and also touching on some of the issues that really matter to those within our industry, but also especially to those without.
Coming from you, I appreciate that so much. On my mind and your words resonating in my ears, especially these past few weeks and months when we hearing words coming out of the Fed, out of Jerome Powell's office about the 75 bip increase that we saw yesterday, and really looking at a 5% future. What is your take on what we're seeing these days?
It's an adjustment. It's a necessary adjustment. It's an inevitable adjustment, really. It's a terrifying adjustment as well, but it is very much an adjustment. And I do find the media frenzy over every single word coming out of central banks quite perplexing, but also sometimes quite interesting and stimulating, and that it's the power of messaging. The central banks, especially the Fed, has never shared as much as they are sharing with us these days. On an average week when they're not in their dark period, we have about maybe between 8 and 15 talks by Fed officials. This is very, very new. And it speaks to the changing role of central banks in economics, but also in our culture. And all of this is at a time when their role becomes ever more crucial in how we live, but also at a time when trust in institutions is changing around the world for factors that actually have nothing to do with central banks even. So it's a particularly fascinating time to sit and watch how the central bank messaging indirectly or hints at how the involvement of these institutions is going to evolve in the coming decades.
What do you think is influencing them? Why such a profound shift? Is it the move toward decentralization? Is it social media? What's the most impactful factors here?
I think right now, for now, largely social media. Decentralization is not so much of a concern to them. But actually, I was reading the history of the Federal Reserve a while ago, and this is something that not a lot of people know. The reason why the United States has several Federal Reserves, it has the New York, it has the Kansas and Louis and San Francisco, it has several because nobody wanted to concentrate power in just one. They cared very much about decentralization in the original establishment of that institution. That's a very interesting parenthesis. But back to the question that you originally asked, why does it matter? It's because, one, social media, but more going beyond that, jumping over that particular obvious answer, it's how our perceptions now matter more than ever in how the economy functions, much more so than before. Obviously, the consumer has always been key in how the economy evolves, and our expectations of inflation influence our behavior. But now more than ever, it matters because markets are a much more integral part in our lives today than they were, say, 50 years ago. Now markets are pretty much everything, and Powell even alluded to this in his press conference yesterday. The role of markets in today's economy is very different than the last time we had this level of inflation to grapple with. So Powell also said this at some stage. My job is the messaging. That's his job, is the messaging, is to get us to understand that he's serious about raising rates until inflation squeaks, and that the market, especially the stock market's determination to look for optimism where there really isn't any, in his words, is quite worrying for the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve does not want the stock market to go up when he says we are going to keep on raising interest rates. But that's exactly what we saw yesterday, until the stock market started to realize, wait, is he serious?
It's on brand, I think, for Powell and for the Fed, but it's also on brand for you. You're pretty on record for actually, looking at times of, burning off or compression of returns. You're looking at things in terms of anti-inflationary policy is actually really stabilizing and market maturing. So how are you feeling about what you're seeing now and where we're headed?
It's exciting. That's not necessarily good, obviously, the curse, right? May you live in interesting times. But it's exciting because this is the change that, you and I have been working for so long. We know change is coming, and we are involved in an industry that is an integral part of that change. And we're seeing it. Change is, however, scary. It's painful. It's very risky. A lot of people get hurt in the process, always. And that is not something we would wish on anyone, especially when, given the changes that we have coming, it is often those that are most unaware that are really going to suffer the most pain. But that is why we do, and all of our colleagues in this industry do what we do. It is very much about getting beyond the current system and finding out how individuals can have greater control over their financial transactions, over their behavior, over their wealth, and over their freedom to say what they want to be able to say and transact the way they want to be able to transact, obviously within the framework of the law. But it's the maturation that we're seeing is also something that's fascinating, maturation of markets more broadly. And to be honest, this started with the great financial crisis, 2008. We saw then what was obviously way a maturation of markets. It was way too sophisticated for the markets at the time. And that's one of the reasons that risk was able to build up in pockets that we weren't keeping an eye on. And many people still to this day don't fully understand what happened. We just had the completion of the unwinding of the Shearson Lehman bankruptcy just a few weeks ago, 14 years later, practically. That's totally nuts. So that, to me, was the big flag that this is the beginning of the end of the current cycle in markets. And this just happened to coincide with the emergence of a new technology that hints at what the next phase of markets could look like.
Can you speak more about that? In preparing to speak with you, I was really looking at some of your past comments about, just sort of the Bitcoin capitulation, I think, and looking at market stabilization. And I was wondering, Noelle, if we were to be facing I've never faced anything like what I think we're seeing and we're about to see, except maybe in the early 80s. If we had the same technology and the same institutional investors, and we were looking at the 2008 situation, or even in the early 1983 through 85 sort of market situation, and we had blockchain, and we had institutional investors, and we had DeFi and the technology we had today, what would be different?
Timing is everything. As you know, back then, would we have been ready for this kind of questioning of the principles? No, because back then there was a whole different set of changes going on. Remember back in the 80s, this was before globalization really took hold. This was before we had the great moderation, and everyone was so excited about the extra profits that all these companies are making by offshoring, not to mention the growth and prosperity in many developing countries around the world from the manufacturing that was reaching their shores. And sure, this obviously left the door open to a lot of malpractice and a lot of unfair, I want to say competitive advantages in certain areas, but a whole different set of problems. It's a reminder that whenever we come with a solution, that does create externalities. But back then in the 80s, none of that had yet happened. We hadn't even had the advent of electronic trading back then. So markets were totally different. This would not have been possible. What we're seeing now would not have been possible back then because there were still a lot of other changes, big, profound changes in the way we see economics and exchange that needed to take place. But fast forward, 40 years, and now it's I don't want to say we're ready because there's just so much to do still, as you know, you fight for this every single day. I don't want to say we're ready, but now, just as the various trends are converging to sketch out in very rough lines what the next type of markets will look like and what the next economic structures will look like, we do have not necessarily the solution, Mona, but we have a new tool in the box, a potentially very powerful tool, a tool unlike any that we have ever had before, and a tool that is not necessarily giving us the answers, as I alluded to, but that is giving us the reason to ask better questions.
That's exciting. It's also treacherous. I think when I think about the reality of what 83 looked like for the bottom billion, now it's the bottom 2 billion, what post 2008 looked like for the entire planet, I think we're facing the same sort of thing. Lebanon is on the cusp of a kind of financial implosion from internal, external forces, like something I've never seen. And this is one of the places in the Arab world, at least, where blockchain adoption and interest and mining are all converging with one of the highest and fastest adoption rates around the world. What do you think future markets hold for people who might be underrepresented or considered, what we used to call unbanked or voiceless? What are these tumultuous times going to leave in their wake?
A lot of pain first, as you alluded to, people in Lebanon holding up bank branches just to get access to their own money. But other areas as well. I mean, just looking at Sri Lanka that can't get access to dollars to pay for the fuel that's sitting in containers off just where its ports. Meanwhile, there isn't enough fuel in Colombo to get people to school. So that kind of thing is happening around the world, and there's a lot of pain and suffering in the meantime. But all of these are exposing the cracks that need fixing. At the same time, we have decentralized markets. Remember, Mona, that Bitcoin emerged retail first. The first liquid asset traded today that emerged retail first on platforms that sprung up spontaneously around the world with no central coordination, no cohesion, no unified technology or even standards or classification. This is exciting, problematic also, because we know of the scams and the big crashes that lost people a lot of money. But at the same time, it was the first time we've ever seen the power of market to emerge where there is a demand, and Bitcoin grew under that kind of a philosophical and, if you like, ideological umbrella. It's the first asset in our history to have done that. All other assets have emerged institutional first and then trickled down to retail. This emerged retail first and is trickling up to institutional. This is an entirely new framework of thinking about markets, how they can get by. We know the power of community markets. I grew up in Zambia, in the middle of Africa, and to be honest, that's why I fell in love with Bitcoin when I realized that I was looking at a technology that permitted permissionless payments, and just realizing what it could do in that part of the world, I got goosebumps. There was a video on Khan Academy, I remember. Obviously, it hasn't worked out like that just yet. It is not used extensively for permissionless payments in various parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, many other areas of the world where it could be very useful. And that's one of the things that makes it even more interesting than I expected, the reasons why. But again, when you say it hasn't worked out like that, we always have to add a very big yet. There's a lot of barriers to overcome, some of them legal, some of them cultural, some of them technological. But it's a very big yet, and the potential is indeed still there, not just for payments, but for exchange, not just for exchange, but for seizure-resistant stores of value. I live in Europe. I think I might have mentioned I live in Spain, and not too far away, we have a land war. Europeans fleeing with what they can carry. We saw this not long ago also in Afghanistan, people fleeing with what they can carry. We saw a few years ago, in Europe, people being denied access to their bank accounts, and talking about what happened in Greece. And then you're allowed a very limited amount of money a day. It's your money. You can think, no, it's actually not. It belongs to the banks that you deposited your money. But examples like this that are happening not just in the developed world, but in developing world, but also in developed countries, make us all realize, hopefully open our eyes to just how fragile the financial system currently is, how privileged many of us are to live in systems where we can transact with relative confidence, but again, some degree of fragility there. And it also comes down to what we've been seeing, trends against privacy. Pandemic, 9/11, we are giving up privacy for safety. And we tend to not get it back once we've done that. Again, these are one another of the many trends that are converging to sketch out a new framework for what our individual rights are and what we come to expect of the governments that we vote for.
I hear your newsletter. I hear your words in my ears. It truly does seem like crypto is macro now. Your background, your upbringing, and all of these factors, the real life stories. How did you come to decide what's the genesis block of crypto is macro now?
The Genesis blog, I love that. I come from traditional finance, as you mentioned, you correctly mentioned, but going back further, I think, as I just mentioned, I grew up in the middle of Africa in Zambia. I was born there. My father was born there. My sister was born there. My mother was born in South Africa, but grew up in Zambia. And so that was our early colonial life for a while. Then moved around countries for quite a few years, changing continents every 3 years. I loved that existence, actually. As a very shy teenager, it was a bit difficult to adapt, but change teaches you to be resilient. And I grew to love it. And that was my plan. My plan was to keep moving continents every 3 years because it's a big ass world and I really wanted to see it. And I was working in finance. I got a degree in applied mathematics and economics from Brown University, which gave me an entry into finance, corporate finance to start with, and then research and then fund management. I left Canada to move to Spain after spending a couple of years in London to do fund management. It was a lot of fun, but and my plan was to do that for 3 years and then move on. But I fell in love with Madrid, which is extraordinary because it's one of the only strains that I don't have in my genealogy. Fell in love with Madrid. Then I fell in love with someone from Madrid. That was 27 very happy years ago. I left fund management when my son was born because back then I was doing futures and options and it wasn't very compatible with breathing. And I set up an e-commerce company back then, one of the first in Spain, which I actually didn't realize at the time. Go figure. Had I known we were that pioneer, I probably would have waited for a bit. Couldn't find exactly. Couldn't find logistics providers willing to work with an e-commerce company because this internet thing is a fad. I mean, why would we not take on that kind of a risk? And investors asking me, why on earth would you put all of your time and your efforts and your personal wealth into, technology that is only used by 30% of the population? That's astonishing. Anyway, I ran that for 13 years, sold it at the end of 2013, and then decided to take some time to figure out what to do next. I was catching up on some reading about what had been going on when I wasn't paying attention, interested in financial technology, interested in economics, and I kept hearing about this thing called Bitcoin. So I watched a video on Khan Academy, I think I mentioned, and the rest is history. Just goosebumps. It's so fascinating. And it's not just about payments even, and this I didn't realize at the time. The more that I pulled at this particular thread, the more I realized I have to just spend the next few years of my life researching the impact this could have. It is really, one, a very beautiful technology and its decentralized nature, but the potential impact, not just on payments, as I said, not just on economics, not just on finance even, but on fundamental things such as ownership, such as privacy, such as independence. It's massive. And it's been a long time, 6 years, I think, 7 years since I've actually been working in the industry and getting paid to do so. And it's just getting more and more interesting. I can't think of any other area that can say that.
To my mind, there's something about that global exposure, the idea that you've actually stood in those lines that people queue up for to be told by their banks where they have really strict monetary controls over what they can and can't do. The idea of portable identity, that you sometimes need a really bureaucratic process to say that you are who you say you are. I walk around my own Egypt or my own region and I find a million beautiful use cases for blockchain every day. And many of them are not related to finance. From the regulator perspective now, from the institutionalizing side of this technology and of what you've seen and what you think is coming, if you were in charge of modernizing by a government mandate, you were in charge of bringing blockchain, bringing digital assets, bringing stablecoins to your government, to your institution, and you're seeing what's happening in the United States, and you're seeing what's happening in Europe, and you know the very strict monetary policy and KYC policies of your own government, how would you be looking at the institutional infrastructure that would be needed to bring this to your government or to your mandate today? What are you looking for to make this work?
The institutional infrastructure that the governments would need to get comfortable with this, that's largely in place. What they want is to make sure that there is a traceability of the flows of funds, to make sure that we're not abetting terrorists or aiding in money laundering. Regulators, however, tend to be more concerned with the retail investors because the mandate to protect the retail investor has a much greater social heft than the mandate to protect institutions who, in theory, should understand the risks that they're getting into. Then again, institutions are systemic, and we don't want to see new technology put any of their stability at risk because that affects so much more than just the institution itself. So this is a fairly long-winded way of coming around to the core of, I think, what regulators need to understand, and that is the potential transparency in crypto asset transactions. This is not the same thing as loss of privacy, but for instance, transparency of being able to see in real time where assets are, what cost they were acquired at, what has happened to them since then, where they're accumulating. The transparency, obviously with many caveats, it's not quite the magic wand it sounds like in many discourses, but the transparency is, in my opinion, what is really going to get regulators around the world on board with adopting this kind of technology for markets. And this brings us back to a question you asked earlier. How are we going to get markets to work their magic in areas where there is not yet enough of an infrastructure or even trust in them? And this is how.
Do you see this push for stablecoins and CBDCs as something that is viable? Is it something that you see as imminent, that it's going to happen? I've waited for this moment for a very long time. When you look at it from your perspective, what are you seeing from that same sort of lens? Are we close?
We're very, very close. It's astonishingly close, much closer than I think most people realize. Stablecoins are already a fundamental part of crypto markets, and they haven't been around for that long. I mean, the growth in stablecoins from 3 years ago, astonishing and a sign of their resilience. They have had a dip, obviously, with the crypto winter that we're in, but not much of one, to be honest. So stablecoins are already a fundamental part of crypto markets. That is not going to change. What is going to change is, again, the transparency over what backs them and some of the regulations, a lot of the regulations, should I say, around them. The regulators do seem to understand the role that they play, not just in facilitating transactions in crypto markets, but there is growing experimentation in how stablecoins can improve market transactions more broadly, even on traditional rails, if that makes any sense. And there is a very short haul from stablecoins to central bank digital currencies, and I'm not as anti-CBDC as many of my peers in the industry, for the simple reason that I sincerely hope, I don't think we will, I hope we never see a time where all other stablecoins are stamped out in favor of CBDCs. I don't think that would work even if any jurisdiction attempted it. So it comes down to 1, convenience, 2, choice. Convenience is what, in my opinion, is going to make CBDCs inevitable. Banks around the world are starting to understand that the flows are easier to trace, the monetary policy is easier to measure, et cetera, et cetera. There are huge risks in this. The risks in terms of loss of privacy, in terms of transaction manipulation or limits even. In other words, loss of sovereignty over our transaction. Yes, that could well happen, but as long as we have a choice, as long as we can choose to not use a CBDC and instead use USDC or any euro equivalent or any other currency type of backed stablecoin that emerges, as long as we have a choice, then the choice is going to be ours. CBDCs are going to be a convenient option for many in many instances, and they're certainly convenient for governments when it comes to cleaning up some of the messiness inherent in currencies today. But here's where I tend to verge away from sort of the typical stance in my industry. I see CBDCs as an on-ramp for greater adoption of cryptocurrency. When CBDCs are a thing, Mona, we're all going to have a wallet on our phone. And once we have a crypto wallet on our phone, then it's just a short step there to layering all sorts of other things on top of it, be they cryptocurrency wallets, be they identity wallets, et cetera, et cetera. That's going to unleash a type of innovation that is not going to come from the central banks. They're generally not that great at the innovation side of it. That type of innovation is generally left up to the private sector. The financial system, the government, hands out the technology, and then it lets innovators build on top of that. And I think that's what we're going to see when we do come to have CBDCs. And it also comes down to, we need to have solved digital identity. And that's what I'm particularly excited about. We haven't solved that yet. CBDCs will not necessarily work until we have but I think we will.
What are the sort of low-hanging fruits of digital identity and KYC that you see happening on an easily palatable, a sort of digestible scale for some of these markets that you're talking about?
A brief step back before I answer that, and I know I tend to give long answers for these questions, but there's just so many interesting things there to pick on. And that is much like crypto, much like Bitcoin made us re-examine what money is. I used to work in traditional finance. I thought I understood money. It turns out I was just conflating it with numbers. Bitcoin comes along and suddenly we're asking ourselves, what even is money to you? What is property to you, etc.? Well, the same when it comes to identity. The advent of cryptocurrencies, the advent of privacy issues, and the potential advent of CBDCs are forcing us to ask the question, what is identity? I can ask, who are you? And you can tell me your name, but then I'm going to say, well, how do I know you're telling me the truth? And then we can get into all sorts of cryptographic ways that you can show me that. But also it comes down to sovereignty. I used to teach a business school here, and I would ask my students, many of them financial executives, and how do I know you are who you say you are? And they would pull out their passport. And I say, okay, who gave that to you? And they say, well, the government. Okay, and the government could take it away, couldn't they? And again, we live in governments where we have the privilege, many of us have the privilege of living in societies where that's very unlikely to happen. But things change, as we know, and most of the world doesn't have that kind of a privilege. So what is identity? Is it something the government gives to you because you are a citizen of that country? And what vulnerabilities does that expose? But also for transactional purposes, how many times have you filled out a long form just to sign up for a newsletter, for instance, or a long form to be able to buy a movie ticket? Or when they don't need that level of knowledge about you, they just need to know that you can pay for this movie ticket. And if you're making a payment, they just need to know that you can make that payment. So what is identity, and who decides? We now are in front of a technology that allows, again, this isn't necessarily exclusive to blockchain. There are digital ways this could be done without it, but we haven't really thought about what the fragmentation of identity would look like. And I think that's where it's going to head towards, the fragmentation of identity. If you want to buy a drink at a bar, they just want to know that you're over 18 or 21 or whatever the rules are where you are. They don't need to know your parents' names. If you want to send a payment to a friend working in Pakistan, they just want to make sure that you're not financing terrorism and that you have the funds to enact that kind of. So it's the question of what is identity for, and who decides how that gets applied?
There's just so much that I want to ask you, Noelle. I feel like I have my favorite textbook and my favorite mentor come to life in front of me. So I don't know how I'm going to cram this all in. Can you say more about that idea of fragmentation of identity? Because it touches on fundamental ideas around privacy and around re-examining the public sector's role to the private sector and an individual's role, I guess, in their government or in their community. And it's really different. In my part of the world, it's just a really different relationship. As optimistic as I tend to be, I'm not sure that we're ready. And I don't know how to make us ready. And I say this in light of actually even looking at really relying on a private sector that is a robust creator of the kind of technology that I want to live in, knowing that, my part of the world is probably we're more consumers than we are creators. We're looking really at our government infrastructure to really lead the way as opposed to the private sector. And then looking in the West, when I look at the private sector and their role in defining the technologies that I live with. And this is like consensus algorithms changing proof of work to proof of stake and what that means for the environment and all of these sort of macro layers that you're talking about, or even algorithmic, what backing an algorithmic stablecoin might mean if it eventually breaks its peg and goes to zero and like melts my face off or melts my industry's face off. What does it mean for the rule makers and governments that I'm afraid of? How can someone from an emerging market or a rising market, from a place like mine, where we don't have the technology and we don't have the private sector yet, but we have a government that has a very different relationship to the identity of its citizens and to the future that it wants to uphold or it wants to create? We are hearing, even in places where fintech is an innovation, we are hearing talks of DeFi. We are, to your point, talking about government-backed coins. We are talking about creating these DeFi rails in a place where the infrastructure is nascent. Noelle, what does the future hold for places like mine?
That's a wonderful question. I absolutely love it. The answer, I think, can be condensed into one word if we're willing to look a decade ahead, perhaps, and that is choice. it is known that when citizens have more choice, they tend to transact more and they tend to trust the platforms on which they are transacting more when they have choice. And this is something that we've seen repeat throughout history. When choice is withdrawn, the economy does suffer. Choice is a very hard thing to control, however, especially when a government depends on the taxation of what it can control. So how can you create a kind of choice for citizens that at the same time does not necessarily wrest away the taxation potential of the government while helping citizens feel more empowered, simply because economically that does make sense. I'm leaving aside all sorts of economic ideologies here, but basically we know that when you have more choice, you do tend to transact more, especially because you feel that you have more agency. Bringing it back to what you started, the path that we started on here, identity. The questions are important. What does the government think identity means versus what do the citizens need for identity? Obviously, very, very different things. But the government's needs have to be respected because they're there for a very good reason. The government does need to know, it does need to be able to validate who is a citizen and who isn't for all sorts of reasons. And it does need to be able to control the flow of said citizens for various protection reasons. When it comes to finance, similar things. The government does need to be able to monitor the flows of funds for financial management, but also for crime prevention. And when it comes to goods and commerce, same thing. There needs to be some kind of control and protection. But when it comes to the citizens' choice, and where you live has had its share of turmoil over the past few decades and will probably continue to have its share of turmoil, especially given what's coming in terms of food and energy shortages, that we're all in for a rather dark time. But at the other side of this is a rethinking of the rights of citizens. It's a rethinking of what citizens expect of their governments and rethinking about the economic self-sufficiency of certain jurisdictions. Get from here to there, it's going to be messy, but that is where we are heading. Again, given what you must have seen over the past decade or so, it is a particularly interesting question when it comes to the identity and the rights that are associated with that identity. So the overlooked issue of identity, it does give you access to certain rights, and this is nowhere more apparent than when it comes to citizenship. Because of the political turmoil that we're seeing around the world, again, in Europe, we are going to be seeing some sharp increases in social unrest this winter, given the economic hardship and the polarization that we're seeing. When it comes to that kind of political turmoil, again, the role of government tends to get questioned, and it's a messy transition. But this is going to tie into what is happening in many developing and also other developed regions, such as the United States with the elections that we have coming up next week. We're going to see big changes in how governments interact with their citizens. And in the end, it is going to come down to, hopefully, to give the governments more validity, more validation for their mission. It's going to come down to giving citizens more choice. And with the technologies that we're looking at, and not just blockchain, but that certainly is up there in the list, it is possible to do so without relinquishing the supervision and the insight that gives the government its reason for being as well as its financing.
Noelle, we are out of time, but I hope we get to check in on you. I hope you check in on us in a few months' time when we ride out this storm, ride out this sort of crypto winter. And I don't know oh man, you just have to check in. We'll see what's happening in a year in the Middle East. I'm so looking forward to keeping in touch with you and hearing about what you're seeing where you are, because we know change is coming, and the change that you see is going to be very different from the change that I see. Is going to be very different from the change that colleagues of ours in the United States and in Singapore see. But we are heading to a new place. I am convinced of it. It is going to be painful, messy, and full of uncertainty, but it is also inevitable, and it will end up placing all the big issues that we're struggling with in a different type of context. And yet, I love that. That's sort of the word I think that's going to get me through some of the stuff that we're seeing. We're on the cusp in Egypt of COP and of looking at climate change. I know that, our industry will be paying really close attention to that. And yet I think is going to get me through that. How do we get people to find you? Where are people going to get your alpha, Noelle?
You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Noelle in Madrid. Every now and then I do tweet photos of Madrid because it is a seriously beautiful city. And I also talk about not just crypto things that I find fascinating, but also what's going on in the macro world because it is getting more and more interesting. I publish a daily and a weekly newsletter on Crypto is Macro Now. You can find that at noelle.substack.com. And also feel free to reach out with questions and ideas at any time.
I hope there's like a food list and a music list. I want all the Madrid hookups. I get all of my macro and some of the best charts. You really synthesize stuff, but I think if they head to the Substack and we see like a paella recipe or something, it should be.
I just might. That's not a bad idea.
Noelle's playlist. Noelle's Eat, Pray, Loving in Madrid. You get all the things, all the
The recipe along with the music that you should listen to while you're preparing it.
Okay. I feel that there's like a crypto cookbook. Thank you so much for joining me today.
No, it's been such fun talking to you. Looking forward to do it again soon.
Our time is up for now, but the conversation is still going. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at SinoGlobalCap, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and leave us your feedback so we can loop it into upcoming episodes.